Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the UW-Madison Social Workers Confronting Racial Injustice Conference. I am very excited to welcome you to this breakout presentation on the role of social workers in immigration legal services organizations, advocating with and for immigrant survivors of gender-based violence through an interdisciplinary perspective. I'm Tova Walsh. I'm a faculty member at UW-Madison, and I'd like to again share our university's land acknowledgement before we dive into our presentation. The University of Wisconsin-Madison and the Sandra Rosenbaum School of Social Work occupy ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called Tejop since time immemorial. In an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both the federal and state government repeatedly but unsuccessfully sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. This history of colonization informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation. Today, UW-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. Thank you again for joining us. I'm delighted to introduce our presenters. We have two presenters who will be leading us in this workshop. Adriana Lopez is a co-director of client advocacy at the Tare Justice Center, where she leads the implementation of their interdisciplinary service delivery model, oversees social service program standards, monitoring and evaluation, and facilitates best practices across offices nationally. Lopez was previously the program manager at Tare's Washington, D.C. area office, where she oversaw the delivery of social services to immigrant survivors of gender-based violence. Prior to that, Lopez worked at the NYC Alliance Against Sexual Assault, where she co-led the Regional Center for Sexual Violence Prevention. Lopez has also worked at Kids in Need of Defense, where she conducted advocacy in Central America and oversaw the delivery of psychosocial services for children facing deportation to Guatemala. Lopez has a master's in social work degree from the University of Michigan and a master's in gender and development from the London School of Economics. She is joined by co-presenter Kirsten Phelps, who is the Director of Legal Programs and Operations, working with the American Bar Association's Commission on Immigration in Washington, D.C. In her role, she supports the direction of legal programming and operations at Commission projects, providing direct services at the border in the San Diego and in the Texas Rio Grande Valley, and to the Commission's Houston-based Children's Immigration Law Academy. Previously, she worked at Tare Justice Center, serving as a staff attorney, managing attorney, and ultimately co-director of client advocacy. There, she supported the organization's 5 offices in delivering high-quality and efficient interdisciplinary legal services to immigrant survivors of gender-based violence, including asylum, VAWA self-petitions, SIJS petitions, T visas, and U visas. Previously, she was the immigration project attorney at the Kansas Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence, where she directly represented immigrant survivors, mentored pro bono attorneys, and provided training and technical assistance to professionals interacting with immigrant survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking. At this point, I'm delighted to turn it over to our panelists. I will let you know that given the large number of attendees, which we're delighted about, we are inviting you to use the Q&A feature to enter questions, but we won't be able to have folks unmute themselves during this presentation. I will help to facilitate the questions and answers, and our presenters are looking forward to having some conversation with you at the end. And I'll also mention, since a couple of questions have come up in the chat, that the recording for this webinar and slides will be made available afterward on our conference website. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Kirsten and Adriana. Thank you again so much for presenting for us today.
Thank you, Tova, and thank you for Adriana inviting me back. Adriana and I were co-directors together, and so it's lovely to be able to present with Adriana again. And I will pass it off to you, Adriana.
Yes, thank you. I feel like this is super exciting and long time coming, because I used to be the lone social worker talking about immigration, and I'm really excited to be able to present and you know, as a part of a social work conference to highlight these very important issues. So we're going to start with our welcome and objectives. So for this session, participants will learn to situate migration through a gendered and racial lens, reveal the intersections of oppression, of violence, and helping systems, identify organizational approaches on the spectrum of interdisciplinary collaborative models, interrogate how building external and internal interdisciplinary partnerships can improve legal advocacy, and identify one barrier to interdisciplinary collaboration that can be investigated in your organizations as a step towards solutions. So as I mentioned, or as we mentioned, we wanted to really start by situating global migration movements through a gendered and racial lens. Oftentimes we talk about these identities of folks in a very siloed way, and the reality is that, at least for the work that Tahari does, intersectionality is really important in the context of migration. It impacts every aspect of a survivor's identity, and so it's really important for us to start thinking about what does it mean to look at gender, or to conduct a gender and race analysis so that we can improve immigration policies and practices. The key being that, we need to think about the push and pull factors that create the conditions under which people are moving or are forced to move around the world, whether they are economic migrants like my parents who came in the 70s and 80s from Mexico, or like my husband who came around 2010 to pursue higher education, or like the asylum seekers and the refugees that we see today arriving at our southern border, who are escaping generalized forms of violence, poverty, oppression, gender-based violence. All of these things influence the way in which they are going to be integrating into our society. And of course, it's on academics, policymakers, practitioners to really think about all of these different identities, intersecting identities and complexities, so that we can build better policies and practices to help integrate successfully folks into our society. Particularly the Tahari Justice Center, which is where Kirsten and I worked together and thought about how we engage with survivors. The Tahari Justice Center is a national nonprofit organization that provides legal and social services to immigrant survivors of gender-based violence. We do so through a multi-pronged approach where we combine direct services with education and training and policy advocacy at the state and national level, really centering the survivors' voice throughout the different phases of our work. And what we know to be a fact is that gender-based violence is a push factor for immigrants. We know that men and boys experience gender-based violence, but the reality is that the majority of survivors of gender-based violence are women and girls and folks who are identified as gender fluid. And that really comes down to the inequities that we have in our different societies that create the precarious conditions and the vulnerability that lead or proceed to that gender, to those forms of gendered violence. Ultimately, a little bit about what we see at Tahari, right, are in thinking about their intersectionality, the different identities that represent our clients. Our clients come from over 60 countries from around the world. Because of our geography, over 80% of our clients come from Latin America and the Caribbean. About 10% come from the Sub-Saharan Africa. About 6% come from Asia, 3% from Middle East and Northern Africa. And so it is incumbent upon us to really think about what experiences our clients bring so that we can better serve them and provide the safety and accompany them on their journey towards justice. The reality that we know is that immigrant survivors at Tahari, the clients that we see, often endure violence and trauma in their home countries, which is again the push factor. many times, the survivors also experience violence on their journey towards the United States. We know, for example, that about 60 to 80% of immigrants who are crossing through Mexico will experience some form of sexual violence, and that a lot of our clients also experience abuse once they arrive to the United States because of the vulnerability, because they may be low-income immigrants who are, again, experiencing poverty in their home countries, which puts them at greater vulnerability, the isolation, the language barriers, etc. About 70% of Tahari clients have experienced violence in US soil, which is a large proportion of our clientele. Obviously, about 71% of our clients have experienced DV, and about half of those who have experienced DV have also experienced other forms of violence in their lifetime, such as trafficking, sexual violence, female genital mutilation, torture, etc. Kirsten, if we can move to the next slide. Which is ultimately, again, is like really thinking about how, particularly as social workers who are often in the front lines and who are also policymakers and community organizers, really thinking about ways that we can more holistically address the needs of immigrant survivors. One thing that we wanted to sort of name, because it would have been a missed opportunity, right, is to talk about how COVID has really laid bare to the barriers that communities of color, brown and Black communities face, particularly how COVID, the pandemic of COVID has impacted immigrant survivors, right, who are also experienced the other pandemic, the shadow pandemic that people often forget to talk about, which is gender-based violence. The reality is that a lot of immigrant survivors are, if they didn't lose employment because they were working in the service industry or the hospitality industry, they are now essential workers, right? We have a lot of our clients who are teachers, are nurses, are working at grocery stores, who are in the front lines during COVID and who are at a high risk of being impacted by the pandemic. So that is like one vulnerability. We also know to be true that a lot of the relief that has previously passed has not addressed the needs of undocumented folks, or undocumented communities, and that folks who are undocumented also cannot access the Affordable Care Act. And so when we're thinking about those who are on the front lines, those who are in precarious working conditions, who are more exposed to the pandemic, and then thinking about the fact that they cannot access the resources and the support, the healthcare that they need, it shows and lays bare this huge barrier and inequity that we have in our society. And then the other thing that we are seeing, for those of you who are working in the housing area, that we know that a lot of our communities, Black and Brown communities, sometimes live in multifamily or multi-generational households where you have many people living in the same household, which makes it difficult to isolate. And in addition, you may have survivors who, unfortunately, because of the pandemic, are stuck at home with abusers. And so it makes the job of social workers and other advocates much more important, right? In thinking about how we are going to respond to their needs and to accompany them as they reach out to organizations like Tahari to provide support. I'm going to turn it over to Kirsten to talk about immigration.
Yeah, and so even as Adriana discussed how, the intersection of really where immigrants, immigrant women, communities of color, and particularly women of color, may find themselves in housing and in employment, and the impact of that is COVID. We also see that the immigration system itself has been impacted by COVID to defer, delay, or deny justice, legal justice to survivors. So we see that in a number of ways. One, through a CDC order under the prior administration under Title 42 to exclude adults and children from the border. So asylum seekers coming to the border have just been turned back. There's been litigation and an order as to children. They should not be turned away at the border because of COVID under Title 42, but adults still are. And we still see that adults, even in a new administration, continue to be turned back and turned away when they arrive at our borders. We also see that the immigration court system, for the most part, saw months and months of delayed and suspended hearings where folks might be pursuing avenues of relief from removal or deportation from the United States and dragging on of their proceedings and all of the emotional labor and uncertainty that is entailed with that. Just dragging on months and months. And even in the affirmative process, where it's a visa application or a non-adversarial immigration court process, we had initial shutdowns in the early days of the COVID pandemic where interviews were canceled or rescheduled. People weren't able to get fingerprints or do other procedural steps of the process to secure levels of safety, or saw further delays in processing, even as the affirmative and non-adversarial benefits portion of the agency, USCIS, in Department of Homeland Security started reopening. There's still significant delays. So there's a lot of uncertainty and delays and not knowing when any of this is gonna get back to quote unquote normal.
And ultimately, right, the competing notions of safety for survivors is it, you know, right? There is I need to be able to put food on the table for my children, and so you have survivors who are unfortunately, you know, having to risk their lives and their health to do precarious work versus, you know, not staying home so that they are not exposed to COVID, but then risking financial instability, et cetera, et cetera. You can go to the next. Ultimately, what all of these different vulnerabilities that come with and oppression, right, that really puts Black and Brown communities and immigrants in particular who come with like unique, who may experience unique barriers, is that all of these, particularly for immigrant survivors, represent a barriers towards justice, right? We have the language access, we have fear and mistrust of state authorities, perpetrator generated risk, control and threats, cultural isolation, immigration weaponized, not just by abusers, but also by state actors, systems that are not culturally and linguistically relevant, and then obviously the economic, employment and housing barriers that we often see. Again, I think we wanted to sort of highlight this because this is really important when we're working with survivors, knowing that there is sort of an expectation that agencies provide services that are linguistically relevant for communities, but oftentimes we see that when state agencies are responding, when survivors are seeking assistance or support, that oftentimes those services that are linguistically relevant are not there. And so what oftentimes ends up happening is that survivors are, having to use the person who is perpetrating the violence against them as interpreters, which then causes the survivor to experience further re-victimization because they may experience dual arrest, they may have services or benefits denied, etc.
Sorry about that, having issues with my mute button. I want to move on to also the intersection of all of these challenges that survivors may face, immigrant survivors may face, another set of barriers that systems really present for them is economic justice barriers. And that can look like a lot of things, but I want to focus as one piece of it, this question of who can work legally, and really invite us to even interrogate what that question even means, right? As a funny side note, I was reviewing these slides and my 13-year-old son said, "What do you mean who could work legally?" And I was explaining that some people who are not citizens of the United States are not allowed to work. They are criminalized, essentially, even civilly, right? They are punished for working without specific permission. And of course, he found it ludicrous that anybody would need permission to work, because who wants to go get a job anyways? But when we think about the fact that, work in this society is how you earn money, which is how you take care of your children, you put food on the table, you keep yourself in you sheltered, you meet your Maslow, your hierarchy of needs, and you get access to benefits and things that provide stability. Like it is frustrating that we have this concept that there's whole classes of people who are not permitted to work legally. But who can in our immigration system? Certainly citizens, folks with green cards who are known as lawful permanent residents do have authorization to work. There are some classifications of visas, such as T visas and U visas, or certain other work visas that come with permission to work. Folks who gain asylum inside the United States or resettle in the United States as refugees are permitted to work. Folks who receive a status called deferred action, which is the umbrella categorization for which things like DACA or the Dreamers that you might have heard about derive their work permission. A status called continued presence, which is tied to visa processes involving trafficking victims. And folks who are inside the United States and have applied for asylum under new rules issued last year under the prior administration, they expanded the wait time for work authorization for folks who are seeking asylum from when they submitted their application. You used to have to wait 6 months in order to be able to legally work. And that has now been extended to a year. So somebody who is arriving, who fears return to their home country and is in a lawful immigration system process, unless they meet a few litigation motivated exceptions, they have to wait an entire year to be able to have the dignity of work, which I think raises a lot of questions and outrage, frankly, in my mind. But other folks are not eligible to work if they're in other processes and haven't gotten the right status or piece of paper in our immigration system in our country. They are not authorized to work. And we know that doesn't make a lot of sense, because people have to work to live and people have the right to live. So I think that's really important to keep in mind as you're thinking about the barriers that the system itself puts in front of immigrant survivors and others.
And the recognition, right? Like financial stability being an important factor in someone being able to escape the abusive situation that they may find themselves in, which also directly correlates with a lot of what we see in terms of housing needs for immigrants. That we know that domestic violence, including sexual violence, is an acute cause of homelessness. From all of the women who experience homelessness, from 22% to 57%, it's because of their DV situation, or the domestic violence that they're experiencing. The National Network to End Domestic Violence also reports that about 65% of victims' average daily unmet requests for help from domestic violence programs nationwide is around housing related services. And we certainly, I think some of the cases that we see at Tahirih in particular, if there is a survivor who is coming, with unstable housing or who has experienced homelessness, it's one of those things where it immediately becomes a high needs case where we have to invest a lot of time like staff to be able to connect the survivor to resources in the community and work with a number of systems to help them. And even then, we end up having to be creative and think outside of the box, because federally, if they can't work and they don't qualify for federal benefits, like we see here, where eligibility to HUD and to Section 8 programs are restricted to green holders and other applicants who may have some form of legal status in the United States, that it makes it really impossible for survivors to remain safe and to not face re-victimization, which we often see, particularly with immigrant communities.
So there are some remedies, quote unquote remedies, under the immigration laws for individuals who have been victimized, whether it's intimate partner violence or other forms of violent crime or persecution. We put on the slide remedies under quotation marks because we talk a lot about legal remedies under the law, and the general definition of remedy is something that's supposed to heal you and fix it, right? You take a remedy for a cold or or an illness so that you get better. And certainly these forms of humanitarian immigration relief do help a survivor with status, which then can be the pathway, a building block to the pathway of greater economic stability, greater housing stability, increased safety from their persecutor or their abuser. But it doesn't stop what caused the issue in the first place, which was the violence, which is, as Adriana so wisely shared in the beginning, is rooted also in gender norms and in systems of oppression and the intersections of those oppressions. But this is not an immigration law class, but I do want to highlight that these are the kind of 5 of the key forms of humanitarian immigration processes for survivors or victims, however they self-identify. And these are the types of cases also that organizations like Tahrir work directly on, that the lawyers and the paralegals work alongside social workers on these cases. You have Violence Against Women Act self-petitions, which provides a parallel pathway for domestic violence survivors who are abused by their spouses that are US citizens or lawful permanent residents, under the notion that somebody shouldn't have to endure a violent, an abusive marriage in order to have immigration status stability, because spouses can generally sponsor their immigrant spouses for status in the United States. You have a category of visas, UNT visas, which are tied to criminal victimization. So there's a wide swath of violence, generally under state law felony offenses, but not always. Crimes like domestic violence crimes, sexual assault crimes, trafficking, labor exploitation, fraud and labor foreign contracting, stalking, some other crimes as well. But it requires that you prove up your victimization and that you prove up that you are helpful to an investigatory or prosecutorial agency, so to law enforcement. T visas are very similar, but they're exclusive for trafficking survivors, whether it's sex or labor trafficking. But again, absent some exceptions you may be able to see, there is that requirement of engagement and help to law enforcement in their prosecution or investigation of the human trafficking. Asylum, as Adriana has already previewed, is something for somebody who fears persecution or harm based on their political opinion, but also some inherent unchangeable, immutable trait about themselves. So their gender identity or their membership in a kind of a particular category of or group in their society in which they have been persecuted on account of that, or they have reasonable fear of persecution on account of that. And that therefore under international and domestic US law, coming out of the World War II and the Holocaust, no one should be compelled to return to their home country if they're going to face harm there. So asylum is a form of relief that lets folks stay here if they get it. But as you may have heard, particularly in the last few years, our asylum system has been really, frankly, under attack and damaged, and folks are not easily able to access our asylum system as easily as they once were. One other form of relief is called Special Immigrant Juvenile Status, or SIJ, and that is a way for abused, abandoned, or neglected migrant children to seek protection and status in the United States if they have been abused, abandoned, or neglected by one or both of their parents. And it involves engagement also with the child welfare system, or at least the child welfare courts in the state in which they're located. So these are remedies, these do help, but it's important to situate, I think, these forms of relief or remedies within an inherently unjust system. These forms of immigration relief and processes to gain, they enable the survivor to gain status, to gain that status that they should frankly have the dignity of anyways, right? And it requires interaction with systems of oppression. Regardless of which of these processes one wants to go through, they have to engage with either the Department of Homeland Security, including perhaps Immigration and Customs Enforcement directly. They have to lay out why they are deserving and how badly they have been victimized to show that they're eligible. They have to pit themselves against their abuser or perpetrator, even if it's a beloved member of their family. And we know that family or interpersonal violence can be complicated. And so it requires kind of displaying themselves out to the Department of Homeland Security or the Department of Justice, ICE, immigration courts, or in the case of U and T visas, law enforcement directly. So there's no path to get a U visa as a domestic violence survivor or sexual assault survivor without reporting to law enforcement and without cooperating reasonably to a reasonable degree, which is pretty vaguely written in the statutes and the regulations, with what they want. And that goes completely counter to the agency of an individual and a survivor, of their whole humanity, of wanting to seek safety, right? Survivors, typically what they want is for the abuse or the harm to stop, and not necessarily, and then to have the decision themselves about how much they want to interact with what justice looks like for them in terms of their perpetrator or their abuser. Because we know that engaging with these systems can reinforce a good immigrant versus a bad immigrant narrative. Who deserves to be welcomed into our country? Who deserves to be handed status, given status and the dignity of work, and then the dignity of status and the ability to reunite with family members, and who deserves to be put in detention facilities, even in a global pandemic with COVID outbreaks in detention facilities. Also, it often requires, and this is something that as an attorney, I certainly struggle with a lot and try to push back against, when we work on asylum cases in particular, but other cases as well, we have to talk about where our clients, the survivors, came from, couldn't protect them, right? Couldn't offer them the protection that they need from asylum in the United States, or how they would be potentially harmed if they returned. And there is a fine line to do that without crossing into reinforcing cultural stereotypes that this individual comes from a bad place, or that a bad, a dangerous or scary brown man or a Black man perpetrated violence against them. We know that interpersonal violence, intimate partner violence, family violence occurs in all communities around the world. No one is immune from it, right? And yet the way that our immigration system is set up, it really kind of forces you to fit into these pegs, these specific narratives in order to merit, to say, I deserve to be safe and I deserve to be here. And that doesn't recognize the full humanity of the survivors or others who were involved in it, their children or their partners or even their perpetrators. And what does it say about our system and our country right now when the only path for so many people to the dignity of being safe, secure, and meeting their basic needs is they have to be victimized by somebody, and then they have to be pitted against and stand up against somebody who victimizes them. And they have to be of value to a system of oppression systems that can oppress or cause harm directly to their own communities, such as we see with law enforcement harming harming at times Black and brown communities or immigrant communities themselves. And frankly, we see that this results in us being able to see that immigration is part of this white supremacy rubric or matrix, and it ultimately places survivors at the intersection of these of this white supremacy rubric. We see that because we see survivors that have to choose. They want the violence to stop, or they want to be safe. But if they they engage with law enforcement in hopes of pursuing a U or T visa, they may be looking at the detention or deportation of their abuser. If they're not a perfect victim, or if they've committed a crime themselves, perhaps at any time, they may find themselves subject to the criminal system or the immigration detention and deportation system. And even if they don't have any of that, but they lose their U visa case or their T visa case, until the last 2 weeks, a new administration move. For the last 2 years, just getting a visa application denied could result in somebody being put in deportation proceedings, even if they've done nothing else that our system says is wrong. They just don't have status, and they tried to get a visa, and the officer that looked at their case decided, I don't think you deserve it. That could have resulted in their own deportation. So there's a lot of risks for survivors, immigrant survivors in this. And then at a broader level, there is also the disproportionate impact that our system has on immigrants of color. So even in the Obama administration, which in some things, folks may have seen be better or worse on immigration, the Obama administration was the one that brought out the line of they're going to prioritize detention and removal of felons, not families. But what if you have a felon in your family, right? Or what if somebody's a felon because of discriminatory or disproportionately racially motivated policing, right? Our police departments that have their historic roots in slave patrols, right? So what does that mean? And the data shows it. There's a disproportionate impact of criminalization and detention and deportation on Black immigrants, including Black immigrant women as well. For example, we've linked here to a wonderful study that the Black Alliance for Just Immigration and the NYU Law Immigrant Rights Clinic put together. So you can look at that after our session. But Black immigrants make up only 7.2% of the non-citizen population in the United States, but they make up over 20% of immigrants facing deportation before the immigration court systems on criminal grounds. There is a pipeline from criminalization and racially motivated and racist white supremacist law enforcement practices directly to a deportation pipeline. So survivors, wherever they fall on this, they are having to navigate and calculate for themselves, what does their individual safety look like? Physical, emotional, sexual safety. But what does their community safety look like? Are they going to take action for their own personal physical safety that results in disconnection or disruption of their community support, which can be just as vital to them? So it's a complicated matrix that survivors are navigating.
Yeah, and I think, making the link that Black communities in particular are are experiencing hyper surveillance in their communities, that jaywalking may result in an arrest, which then results in ICE being looped in, and which then thinking about the broader scope and realizing that Black immigrants are 3 times more likely to get deported, right? That it's all sort of interrelated, and that the systems of oppression are in which survivors and communities, Black and Brown communities, have to operate, that oftentimes those systems are not necessarily really thinking about the safety of these communities, right? And so to that end, particularly over the last number of years, where we knew that there was a lot of hyper surveillance, where we knew that there was a lot of internal enforcement in the United States, and that law enforcement agencies were collaborating with immigration officials, and in particular regions. The Tahirih Justice Center, along with I believe 4 or 5 other national organizations, ended up doing a survey nationwide with advocates who are working with immigrant survivors of gender-based violence. And what we learned is that, through their advocacy, we know that 76% of advocates report that immigrant survivors have concerns about contacting the police. That 3 out of 5 advocates report that immigrant survivors have concerns about going to court for a matter related to, the abuse, and that 52% of advocates who work with immigrant survivors ended up dropping civil or criminal cases because they were fearful of continuing or even showing up to court. And so really tying and weaving how these systems interact with survivors, and in the way that Kirsten was explaining, how they are forced to interact with agencies that may see them as dangerous individuals, right? That may not always see them as an individual who is experiencing abuse and who may need support, that puts them instead at greater risk and more vulnerability. If you can move to the next slide. So this really leads us thinking about all these different barriers, all the systems of oppression that immigrant survivors have to face in order to seek safety and justice, and hopefully thrive in the communities, right, that they live in. We have to be able to dismantle those systems at an individual level and at a systemic level. And it means building bridges across communities, across agencies, across disciplines, to really look at the intersections and the tensions and the barriers that survivors encounter, so that we can find new ways of supporting their whole humanity. Can you move to the next slide? So you'll for those of you who are practitioners who are in the front line supporting immigrant communities and immigrant survivors, this spectrum may seem somewhat familiar, right? In the way that we typically, as an agency, approach our work when we are serving immigrant survivors. We have the traditional siloed approach, the formal and informal interagency collaboration when you have the task forces. You have multidisciplinary agencies where you have two disciplines that are housed under the same umbrella, and then you have interdisciplinary agencies, which is where Tahirih is. And Kirsten will go a little bit more into that in a little bit. But ultimately, the idea is, because we understand that all of these different barriers impact survivors' access to safety and justice, that we need to make sure that we are collaborating and communicating closely so that we can understand the impact that one team's advocacy and scope of work has on someone else's. And so what you may often see, for example, in the siloed approach to legal advocacy, which is the area that Tahirih occupies is that you have, as Kirsten was talking about, you have the immigration attorney who is trying to help the survivor navigate and secure immigration relief through the forms of relief that Kirsten outlined for us. Then we have the criminal justice system, who is, you know, the one who has to cooperate and provide testimony and attest that you were victimized by someone. Then separately, you have an advocate who is, you know, from a community agency who is helping you navigate resource referrals, navigating systems of advocacy. You may have family law and civil attorneys, particularly for immigrant survivors who may be single parent households, who have children, who are an important part of how they are able to seek safety and safety for their children, right? To preserve the family unit, that they end up collaborating or seeking support from family law attorneys to get support on divorce, on you know, any sort of like child related matters. Then you have your therapists and your counselors who are focusing on the mental health needs, and in addition, all the other systems, the education system, you know, childcare system, the medical system. We could go on and on, but ultimately all of these are separate, not talking to each other, and it means that this number of systems that the survivor is interacting with is the same number, right? That this person is having to retell their story and relive the trauma that they have experienced. And how many times do we often find that survivors end up getting discouraged because they have to retell their story and ultimately be re-victimized by this whole process. And how much expertise do each of these actors really have on the way that they are impacting on someone else's work? I will always remember a case that I started early, I think my early years at Tahirih. We were working with a survivor whose husband is a diplomat, or was a diplomat in the United States, and who, you know, has immunity. And so she had survived or lived domestic violence, and it eventually went into hiding, and was scared to even go to family court to pursue financial support for her children, because, you know, this person has immunity, and if she was found, he could continue to perpetuate violence. Not being able to get child support, not being able to work because she at the time was undocumented, with 5 children, right? Put her in a financial instability, which then led to her facing homelessness. And this was a never-ending cycle. And I remember at one point when I started working with the survivor, we were sitting at a community meeting with the survivor and about 10 advocates. We had school social workers, we had the immigration attorney, pro bono attorney who was helping. I was there with my intern. We had housing advocates, we had shelter advocates. And I remember the solution that the advocates had found is, we want to move this survivor to about they wanted to move the survivor to West Virginia, because we were in Virginia. And immediately, right, thinking about, okay, that may be a solution because you're identifying that housing is cheaper in West Virginia, and you may have a partner there who might help them with immediate housing. But this is only a temporary solution, because if you move the survivor, you know, immigration is organized in that we wouldn't be able to represent her, and she may, even if she found an immigration attorney in the area that she was going to live in now, that oftentimes in different areas, immigration judges may not be as friendly towards asylum seekers, and those areas may end up having higher denial rates for asylum. And so it highlighted for us, once we started uncovering how our work was related and that we really needed to be communicating with each other. Otherwise, we were only identifying band-aids, and we're continuing to push sort of like the long-term outcome essentially wasn't going to be to the benefit of the survivor. And so it was to our advantage and to the survivor's advantage that we all come together periodically to help address her needs, both immigration, financial, housing, emotional, provide support for childcare, etc.
Yeah, Adriana, I think that one of the things that resonates for me always with that example, and of course I remember Tahiri's work with that person very well, is that one, none of us live siloed lives, right? We're all, especially in COVID, in case you hear screeching in the background, because I, like many, am juggling parenting and homeschool and work from home and, health issues, right? Like we all have multiple issues going on at any one time that we're trying to juggle. And so for individuals who are survivors or otherwise confronting violence or some other form of injustice, take that and multiply it, right? The need for coordination and for communication and for thinking about the whole, right? It's a whole person, a whole human. And how can we acknowledge the whole humanity if we insist on metaphorically slicing up this person into their distinct, quote unquote, unrelated problems that usually aren't actually unrelated. And I also remember with that particular survivor and others too, all of the barriers, all of the challenges that this woman was confronting and navigating were inevitably also affected by the add-on layer of discrimination and of racism as well. So whether it's with immigrant survivors, particularly Black and Brown immigrant survivors, as they're navigating these systems, there is judgment, there is racist or stereotypical assumptions, right? We can jump to a place of like, well, why do you keep replicating the same cycle of leaving it? Well, because we're not seeing the whole humanity, or we're not seeing the whole picture behind it, because we're not talking to each other. So with that, there are ways to move beyond a siloed approach. And so we're going back to this graphic again briefly so that I can talk briefly about the main features of these other models. And as you move along the spectrum to the right, you're growing more integrated, more interdisciplinary, more entwined as service providers and helpers to approach a more integrated solutions to navigating barriers, both at the individual level and at the systems advocacy level. Because for those of you who are macro focused or otherwise systems advocacy focused, we actually dismantle the barriers when we change the systems or we re-envision new systems. So if we speak to formal or informal and interagency collaborations, what we have is still a siloed approach essentially, but we say, hey, we're going to get together in a coordinated community response team or in a task force, or we're just going to have an MOU to meet up with our partner agencies so that we can better understand the issues and the barriers, and perhaps depending on the collaboration, speak directly or talk directly about the situation of individual survivors. That requires a ton of consent forms, that requires navigating the safety of participation in that as it relates to individual survivors. All the time, there's going to be limits of what partners in an interagency collaboration can share. So it's certainly better than a blinders on approach where you're just not even thinking about the other systems involved. But there's there's still a lot of rigidity to an interagency collaboration model that doesn't fully address or respond to the movement and the fluidity and the complication of how these systems and barriers intersect and fit together for the survivor on any given day. I'll also note that a lot of formal and informal interagency collaborations, particularly formal ones, in the gender violence space tend to involve law enforcement. So that's not inherently a bad thing, but we think about what that means when we're talking about the roots of law enforcement, policing, where it comes from, the challenges and the systemic problems that we see in law enforcement systems and prosecutorial systems, and how they present at times more danger than safety for survivors. It's worth questioning or interrogating our collaboration, our direct formal collaboration with law enforcement. And that's a tension, right? Acknowledging the tension that collaboration can help as you're navigating or advocating or helping individual survivors. As we move on from MOU land and informal or informal interagency collaboration, we have multidisciplinary agencies, which, as Adriana previewed, is that model of different disciplines, like think of them as departments within a single umbrella organization, but still very much operating independently, with independent decision-making, independent judgment. So a classic example of this is a medical legal partnership, for example, where you may have attorneys operating inside of a hospital or a community clinic, and there's internal referrals back and forth. You know, in the literature and in the field and in the practice, the use of the term interdisciplinary versus multidisciplinary can vary some, but what we're operating from, and at Tahirih we operated from, is that multidisciplinary would have meant that our social services, our social workers, and our non-social workers that you know, our case managers, things like that, operated in one department, and our legal team, our attorneys and paralegals, operated in another. And if we were going to be multidisciplinary, we would have had very formal referrals within Tahirih, and independent intake processes, and requiring very detailed informed consent and shielding and separating and segregating information. So no free flow of information between the social worker and the lawyer without very explicit written consent. So multidisciplinary agencies are more collaborative, are more fluid than interagency collaboration, because they are the same umbrella organization, but they still have, it's like having 2 teams or 3 teams or however many disciplines you have in the organization working with a single person, a single survivor or clients. And then to the right is interdisciplinary, which is the the really emerging model in legal services, in civil legal services and family legal services. It's less new, but still not the predominant model. And in immigration legal services, it's really emerging rapidly now because of everything we've talked about so far today, right? We've talked about the intersecting oppressions. We've talked about all the barriers that immigrants, survivors or non-survivors, face in our country. This approach of attorneys being overwhelmed of like, what do I do with all of the stuff that I wasn't trained to deal with, and I'm just muddling along with my client. There's got to be a better way, and I really believe, and I'm here with Adriana because she believes it too, that interdisciplinary approaches are really the future of how we as quote unquote helping professionals actually acknowledge and help the whole person in front of us. So when we're looking at interdisciplinary agencies, we are needing to first identify that the agency itself is going to have a primary purpose. So as Adriana mentioned, at Tahirih, we are a legal services organization that has integrated on staff social workers and non-social worker, case assistants and managers for many years. But ultimately, Tahirih is I say we because Tahirih will always be a part of me. Tahirih is a legal services organization, right? So that's the primary purpose. That's the entry point of services. If the survivor didn't need any legal assistance of the type that Tahirih offers, Tahirih is not going to serve them, right? even though they may have many needs that a social worker otherwise could assist with. But in an interdisciplinary agency, you have professionals of other disciplines working with that legal staff on survivor-centered teams to address those holistic needs, right? That impact their access to justice and their legal goals. And I encourage here, and I speak as the lawyer on this panel, to say legal goals is often misidentified as a very strict or narrow approach of winning a case, winning a legal case in court, or getting a visa application approved. Certainly that's going to be a goal of an immigrant survivor that an attorney is representing, but in an interdisciplinary context, we have to think about the legal goals can be broader than that, right? The legal goal is to achieve status, stable status and safety, right? To be able to advocate, to have due process, to be able to move forward on their path and journey to justice. And so that means that we have to be willing to look at all of the things that impact that and be willing to work together to address all of it. In a truly interdisciplinary agency, information is exchanged freely. So if it's a legal services primary purpose agency, then attorney rules of professional conduct tend to lead in terms of structure and how people are situated. So you have interdisciplinary agencies where staff, even non-attorney staff or social work staff, may fall under the shield of attorney-client privilege because they are on that attorney-client team, and they're not an independent or a quasi-independent agency or team operating separately from it. Certainly, if it's a medical leading or a social services leading organization, that may vary as well. But the takeaway is that in a truly interdisciplinary approach, there's going to be a primary purpose, and that doesn't necessarily mean that is the person who gets to decide, that discipline gets to decide everything, but it's the primary purpose of the agency under which you structure your staffing and your organization of your staff teams in order to maximize the ability to holistically serve that survivor that you're working with. Do you want to talk to us about some of the principles of interdisciplinary work, Adriana?
Yeah, of course. So, I mean, we've the idea here is that, achieving true interdisciplinary teamwork is a process, and it is fluid, and there are a lot of things that are important to keep in mind. Primarily, when we're thinking about Tahirih, as Kirsten was just talking about, is we want immigrant survivors to reach safety and justice. Sometimes the survivor may say that the most important priority for them, right, is to talk to a therapist before they go through their declaration process, so that they can be ready when they are going to be talking about the abuse that they experienced for years, and so that they are not, experiencing so much re-traumatization when they are going through that process. Sometimes it means that the survivor, is experiencing homelessness, or a family member may be experiencing re-victimization, a child, and so it's important for then our team to put a pause and really think about safety and what safety means to the survivor. And so it reminds us to keep going, right? That the trauma-informed thing to do is to center the survivor's voice and the survivor's goals, and to always be authentically centering that, so that we can meaningfully engage with them. It means that we organize as a whole client care team, right? Kirsten was talking about the fact that within multidisciplinary models, you have teams coming together, but they're not continuously talking, right? And when we begin to organize as a client care team, right, we see each other like working towards those same goals. We think about how the division of labor happens. We think about the fact that the survivor is always the one who is leading the process and communicating to us what their priorities are, even when we sometimes may not necessarily agree about what those priorities may be. It also is, one of the things that often, obviously, in any team situation comes up is that there may be competing priorities and competing tensions. And so again, what does it mean to truly center the survivor, to keep the goals of your program in mind, which at Tahare, like we said, it's the safety and the justice, and only the survivor gets to define that for themselves and their family. And so constantly making sure that we are communicating with each other if issues are coming up, that we are, being mindful of how we are, problem solving, and making sure that we are not sort of taking ownership of what that problem solving looks like, that we are authentically engaging that survivor in the process so that they are the ones who decide, what the outcome is going to be, and how they want us to engage in supporting them through some of the barriers that they may face, and that we are consulting with each other. I talked earlier about the fact that we started working with a survivor who had very many needs, and it was so important for us, because she had 5 children, that we were constantly looping in our family law attorneys, right? Like making sure that we were aware in this jurisdiction, what does the law say in terms of a teenager taking care, right, of younger children? What are the restrictions? What are the boundaries? Like really making sure that we were consulting with one another on our expertise, so that we could more holistically support the survivor, and that there is appropriate supervision and management. And this is one of the things that I really enjoy at Tahare, that when I was serving as a social services program manager with the managing attorney, we really saw each other as co-managers of a larger team. She wasn't, like just focused on the feedback and the needs of the legal team. We were talking about co-leading a team full of people who had background in psychology, people who had been EMTs, who had expertise in crisis management, people who had family law, immigration expertise, social workers, right? That we were taking into consideration all of their needs, all of their ethical obligations, all of their input, and that we were looking at the whole picture so that we could successfully support the survivor.
Yeah, and I'll just piggyback off of that, Adriana. Adriana's title and my former title was very intentionally selected and contemplated, as that we were co-directors. So even at sort of the national and high level within the organization, we presented and modeled for down the line managers, for supervisors, and for individual contributor staff, from all the disciplines, that this is one team. We are one programmatic client services, client serving team. And so even at the high level, whether it was a legal question or like a more of a, what lawyers might consider more of a social work question, within the bounds of reasonable ethics, Adriana and I as co-directors crafted decisions, sought input, analyzed input, made programmatic decisions, made hiring recommendations and staffing recommendations together. And I'm speaking, I suspect, to mostly social workers attending this, so I think perhaps this will land better. As an attorney, I welcome the opportunity sometimes to step back, but that's a challenge in working with attorneys, because we are not trained to do that. We're trained to be like, we're in charge. We know we have ethics rules that are important, that we must abide by, about independent judgment and independence in our advocacy. But that doesn't mean that we can't bring more experts to the table with us and consult and welcome that wisdom in making decisions, and that ultimately we are not ethically doing our jobs as attorneys if we are not centering the survivor and walking the walk of the survivor being the leader of that team. Certainly the survivor or the client in a legal context may want to make decisions that we cannot ethically abide by, or may want to take a course of action that we think is risky and not advisable. So our role is, as a team, to present that and discuss it and go through it, because recognizing the full humanity and serving the full humanity of an individual or helping does not mean that we make decisions for them. It means we help them understand the path and the map through which they are walking, the maze through which they are walking. And if a person decides to make a decision that as an attorney I don't agree with, as long as I'm not ethically required to withdraw or take some sort of severe action, that's it. Maybe we lose the case. Maybe the case doesn't go as well. Maybe I don't get to make the really cool novel argument in that asylum case that I really wanted to, because my client just refused to give me the information the information that I know she has from her experience, but that's not safe for her to testify to, right? And we have to be willing to step back to do that. And I think regardless of the discipline, that's the disciplines present at the table in an interdisciplinary survivor-led team, is that you have to have that willingness to step back and to check our own selves, bring our wisdom, but step back and be willing to accept the wisdom of others, and to center and give primacy to the wisdom of the survivor leader of the team. And that leads to conflicts that we have to work through, heightened need for communications, and really building trust in team within teams as well. So there are challenges, of course, with that, and I've previewed a few of them, right? One challenge is, I won't speak for all attorneys, but I do know attorneys, and I probably have been an attorney at a time that didn't want to step back, right? That didn't want to step back and just wanted to proceed with what I thought was the best course of action, because that's what my training, what the system that I am a part of has taught me to do. And so systems work involves working on the legal system as well, and perhaps even the social work system as well, right? To advance it to new models. But we have to understand each other's roles and expertise. It really requires us to step back and say, here's what I know, and here's what I don't know. Or I've heard new information from my colleague that has expertise in de-escalation or in mental health, and now I know that we need to find a different course together, right? We have to be able to trust each other and effectively communicate, right? If advocacy work and helping professions work, including social work and community and client-led lawyering, is walking the walk, it's accompanying, right? It's accompanying and helping shine sort of the light so that we can see the paths ahead. It's not saying, grabbing by the hand and yanking you along and saying, this is the way we have to go, right? And so we have to, the more wisdom we can bring in about what lies out there, whether it's the housing system or the immigration system, or the criminal prosecutorial system, we have to welcome that, and we have to be able to step back and say, there's things I don't know, or there's things that I thought I knew that turns out I was wrong about. That requires a tremendous amount of trust and communication building. That's really hard to do interagency, and that's why interdisciplinary is talking about under one roof, one team, right? Where you really need your managers, your supervisors, managers, and leaders to be modeling it and to be expecting it. That can also be hard because that also requires people who are joining the organization or an interdisciplinary modeled agency to be okay with that. It's uncomfortable. There's discomfort in new ways of doing things. And, both in my experience at Tahirih and, being able to communicate with organizations in other parts of the country that are also exploring and advancing or evolving towards interdisciplinary work, it's a big question to ask, you know, and to be ready for how we talk about how we work, what the culture of that teamwork and communication is, and how do we ensure that we're recruiting and retaining those folks that really are committed and willing to dig into an interdisciplinary approach. And then another really big challenge is it's so easy in the chaos and the hecticness and the busyness and the intense workloads to lose sight of the goals, right? If we go back to the goals being that the goals are whatever the survivor leader of that client-centered care team is, those are our goals, and how can we get there? How can we achieve them as much as possible together as a team? Adriana, do you want to add to that? I know you all have had examples of where you've confronted those challenges.
Yeah, of course. And I think, you know, I can share an example, and it kind of relates a little bit to a question that I saw earlier, which was the issue of mandatory reporting that came up where our social services providers were able to identify something that merited a little bit more, a closer look, right? And ultimately, through working with both our legal and our social services staffing, recognizing that the survivor, our client, was not a perpetrator, that ultimately, if we did not report, it would, if someone else who didn't have the context, who didn't understand that she was a survivor of violence, makes a report, that would ultimately impact their immigration case, right? And so sitting authentically again with the survivor and explaining to them what are the consequences of not reporting, and then the survivor, once they are empowered with the knowledge about the different outcomes that can happen, right, for their safety, for their children, for their immigration case, that the survivor, themselves said, I want to be able to be a part of this reporting process, that ultimately then provided us the opportunity to advocate for her, to connect her to prevention programs, to connect to her family and her children to therapy, because they had, survived domestic violence and had seen domestic violence in the home, that by us, instead of, sort of focusing on, well, my ethical obligations say I cannot report and my ethical obligations say I can, without consulting with the client and actually presenting the information to them and talking about the choices that they had, that would have been inauthentic, right? And so ultimately what it means is that if our goal is to reach safety and justice, that looks in a variety of different ways. And it means presenting all of those options to the survivor so that she understands the implications of what it might mean if someone else reports without having the whole context, right? And so that was that was an eye-opening experience, I think, for a whole team. And it really made us think about the different, to really assess the whole situation from a broader perspective than we were used to, which is just focusing through like our narrow perspective. Yeah, and then I think the last thing is, and I realize that there are some questions that folks want to ask, and so I'll just go really quickly through these, which is if you're thinking about an interdisciplinary perspective, what are the key things that you need to be thinking about? One of them being, as Kirsten talked about earlier, is the entry point for survivors to access your services at your agency. What is the discipline that typically falls within? At Tahare, that's the legal realm. Do you have needs that are not met through other forms of collaboration? what are the ethical duties of the disciplines and can they be reconciled? I just sort of provided an example of where we really had to think about broadly, right, the implications for the survivor from multiple perspectives, and ultimately presenting the information to them so that they could make the final decision. And is the agency ready and committed to building the groundwork of trust, collaboration, recruitment, and retention, which is, I think, ultimately another big piece of it, that you need buy-in at all the different levels of the organization, from the frontline workers to management, and that it's going to take ongoing training, as we talked about, supervision and management, to really make this interdisciplinary model successful within agencies. I'm going to
Right.
stop here in the interest of time. Go ahead, Kristen.
Yeah, and I think I just want to, as I see that we have, questions, and we want to make sure we have time for them. I think that, we are big believers in the interdisciplinary model. It doesn't necessarily mean that it will work for every organization or every setting. The goal is not necessarily you must become an interdisciplinary agency where you're working, but how can we move along that spectrum towards more collaboration and, where possible, more interdisciplinary approaches? And it is an evolution, and it is ongoing work. There's no light switch to flip where one day you're just working interdisciplinarily or not. A lot of the questions on this slide, and then I see others raising as well in the Q&A, they're tricky. They may be jurisdictionally dependent on whether you can have creative approaches to mandated reporting and attorney ethics rules or other professional ethics rules, as well as what's the level of risk tolerance. Certainly at Tahirih, as we were approaching these, we did work intensely with our general counsel and other and spoke with other organizations as well. We didn't just walk into this without significant research or consideration of all of the potential implications. So at Tahirih, where Adriana continues to co-lead us, just as mentioned, we engage with the survivors to provide interdisciplinary representation. That means that there is teams that involve immigration and family law attorneys, as well as legal support staff, social services, so social workers and non-social workers in program manager roles, and associates and case aides. Tahirih also has a forced marriage initiative, complementary service. There's litigation attorneys, there's policy counsel and advocates. So even outside of the direct client services, there's a lot of interdisciplinary collaboration on individual and systems level advocacy.
And how might your collaboration evolve? What disciplines and systems should be engaged to address the survivor's holistic needs? How might your agency approach these needs? Which model would you use in the short term or long term, and why? These are just like some things to think about as you are, thinking whether this may be a good model to bring to your organization or to start exploring, right? And what challenges could you see arising in a collaborative, multidisciplinary, or interdisciplinary setting? What tools could be used to address and mitigate some of these challenges?
So good questions for to sort of take home with you after this as you continue to think and discuss with your colleagues. I know that we are approaching on time, so we can see if there are questions that we should answer that have been submitted, which I see there are several. Adriana, are there any questions that you want to take that we can answer live?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can go down the line, down the list. Could you talk about how social workers should handle immigration issues during the COVID pandemic? Could this person actually be a little bit more specific? Like, what part of immigration issues are you talking about?
I
You're
think,
not able to unmute, but you can use the chat if you wanted to expand the questioner.
while they are maybe expanding, I can say as the lawyer, not the social worker, I think it is really important for social workers or other helping professionals to not make assumptions about immigration impacts or immigration status or who's eligible for what, because it is incredibly complex. We could have a week-long training just on public benefits access based on, your immigration status or statuses. And so to really partner, get to know immigration advocates or attorneys in your community, if you don't have them in-house where you're at, because it's important to have good information. Abusers exploit bad information, abusers weaponize the immigration system, but also, there's a lot of rhetoric and a lot of confusion out there, and that is exacerbated in a pandemic and can really exacerbate safety concerns.
Yeah, and I would say, knowledge is power. And one of the things that we often talk about, particularly, I think the last 4 years, when there was a climate of fear, right? Every day, as Kristen can attest, there was like some bad policy that was being changed that was going to impact survivors, or immigrant communities generally, in a way that was detrimental to their well-being, that a lot of times media sort of exacerbate because they are only presenting snippets, right? And so oftentimes we had survivors where policies would not even be related to them, would not even have an impact on them because they were pursuing humanitarian forms of relief. But oftentimes they would hear things in the media and would, for example, unenroll their U.S. citizen children from public benefits that they have a right to access. And so what we oftentimes, what we say to social workers is, as Kristen said, get to know your lawyers. We as social workers have the power, right, of being able to facilitate access to information and resources. And so it's important to know which agencies, and thankfully you have, an organization like Tahari who can provide some of that information, and it's readily available in our website so that you can clarify the misconceptions and the misinformation that oftentimes ends up negatively impacting immigrants and immigrant survivors in particular.
Yeah, just as a small example, I have a former Tahari client who likes to stay in touch with me, which is wonderful. And I have, over the past 2 years with public charge and this wealth test rules for immigration that's been up and down, and is it in effect or not, I have had at least 6 conversations with her, urging her to reconsider unenrolling her U.S. citizen child. And even now in a new administration, I've heard from her to say, do I need to unenroll or not unenroll? And, of course I say, I'm no longer your attorney, but talk to your attorney. This is complicated. So it ebbs and flows a lot. I think, let's see.
We talked a little bit about the ethical obligations.
Yeah, I think that this one is really about how the organization is structured and the agency is structured and what the agency is willing to commit to. Some organizations will go more multidisciplinary with more firewalls, and some, depending on the local or state rules, are able to be more interdisciplinary. Where I think the example that Adriana gave earlier is really quite telling, because we bring as professionals a lot of assumptions about how horrible it will be to file a report or not. Sorry, I have a 3-year-old that's decided to join the panel. So I'm going to mute my camera momentarily. In the end, what does the survivor want, right? And if you have competing or contradictory ethical obligations, in an interdisciplinary setting, laying that out up front so that the client or the survivor has full agency and autonomy to decide what to share with whom is really, really critical. So again, just going back to those fundamentals of making it, putting the power where it belongs in the client or the survivor's hands.
Yeah, and I think, you know, what that looks like in the day-to-day is, like Kirsten said, making sure that when you are doing your intakes, that you are communicating to the client that whatever is said to one team member is going to be shared with the whole team. And the other thing that I want to point out that is really critical, like Kirsten said, is that the jurisdiction analysis is really important. We have offices in Texas, and you know, in Texas, lawyers and social workers are mandated reporters. And so again, really thinking about our assumptions and doing the research ahead of time so that we can make sure that we know how to best situate teams and provide the support that survivors need.
So we are coming up to 3:15 now. So I think I'm going to interject and wrap us up. We've had a handful of wonderful questions, and I'm glad that we were able to get to some of them. And I mostly just want to thank our terrific presenters for sharing their time and expertise and all of this valuable information with us today. So a big thank you to Kirsten and Adriana for presenting, and thank you to everyone in attendance for being a part of this event, as well as thank you for your commitment and efforts to confront racial injustice. Please keep an eye out on your email for a link to complete an evaluation on today's presentation, and then watch for a separate email that will come regarding CEUs for those who requested them. We hope to see you next week, February 12th, for part 2 of this conference, and a big thank you to everyone.